There's a fair amount that's happened since we last spoke. We now have at least a proposed pill on COVID-19. We've got approval for at least some children to be inoculated. Tell us what comes next in this saga.
Well, what comes next, David, is how well we get the country vaccinated. It's a really good news that the FDA has given the emergency use authorization and the CDC has recommended vaccinations for children from 5 to 11. There are 28 million children in that demographic category. And if we can get the overwhelming majority of those vaccinated, not only would be a great relief to parents, protect the children, but it would have an impact on the dynamics of the spread. So that's one good news. You mentioned the fact that we now have 2 orally administered antivirals, one of which has received an emergency use authorization from the FDA, molnupiravir, and the other, which has got good results from Pfizer, a protease inhibitor, which is now applying for an emergency use authorization. Those drugs, when given early, within the first 3 to 5 days of symptomatic infection, do a great deal of diminishing the likelihood that a person's infection will progress to hospitalizations and death. Now, with regard to infections, we continue to see a downward trend in cases, in deaths, and in hospitalizations. But we seem to be plateauing at around 70,000 cases a day over the last several weeks. And we want to make that slope of decline to be much sharper in its deflection. And the way you do that is you get more people vaccinated. You know, we still have about 60 million people in this country who are eligible to be vaccinated, who have not yet gotten vaccinated. We've got to get them vaccinated as we go into the colder months of the winter, when you have other respiratory infections like influenza and others that could complicate the picture. So it's a mixed bag. In general, some really good news, but we really keep our foot on the pedal and not pull back as we get into the winter months.
So, Doctor, you just laid out a perfect framework for this interview. So let's take it in order. First, with the childhood vaccinations. Do you have numbers about the rate at which children are getting vaccinated? I think it only just started something like last Thursday, but how fast are they taking it? And maybe as important, do you have a sense of whether parents will be even more resistant on their children than they are for themselves?
Well, I can give you an answer clearly on the second question. I don't have the numbers yet for the first question, because although we seem to be doing very well, I mean, if you look at some of the clinics and the pediatrics offices, there are certainly an awful lot of children from 5 to 11. But the question you asked, David, is a very relevant one about parents who will be asking important, reasonable questions about the vaccine. And that's the reason why we're putting out a major effort to get the information that's correct information, get it in multiple media, get it from trusted messengers. The vaccine is very safe in the 5 to 11 group, as well as highly effective. It's about 91% effective in preventing getting symptomatic disease, which is very, very good. And in that age group, the safety profile looks very good. So there's every reason for a parent to be actually enthusiastic about getting their children vaccinated.
So, Dr. Fauci, we have a viewer actually who wrote in as you were talking and asked about herd immunity. And the question specifically was, once we get to childhood vaccinations, will we get to herd immunity? Or let me ask it a different way. Have we given up on herd immunity as a practical matter?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, if you look at the overall conceptual definition of herd immunity, is when you get enough people protected in the community, either from having gotten infected and recovered, and we do recommend that those people still get vaccinated, plus importantly, the percentage of the population that's vaccinated. You will know when you get to that point, when the cases are so low, they're barely detectable. That's what herd immunity means. We don't know what that percentage is, David. We know what it is for measles. For measles, it's over 90% of the population needs to be vaccinated. We don't know precisely what that number is. So rather than focusing or fixating on a number, let's just get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can. And when we get to that point, we'll know it. It will be very obvious.
Related to that, Dr. Fauci, is masking. I mean, there's certainly the issue of masking in schools. A lot of schools opened up with masking requirements. As we get to have the kids vaccinated, and for that matter, as we already have a lot of adults vaccinated, does that recommendation of masking start to go away?
David, it ultimately will go away, but we're not there yet because we still have enough dynamics of infection in the community, particularly, as I mentioned a moment ago, the weekly average of a daily number of cases is about 70,000 per day. That is much too high to be pulling back on mitigation methods. We've seen now in Europe, in some of even the Western European countries, like Germany and Denmark and others that have pulled back on some of their mitigation, they are now starting to see a surge. We don't want to do that. We're on a downward trend. We want to keep going on a downward trend. We're not going to be having to wear masks forever. But for now, particularly as the CDC recommends, in indoor congregate settings where you don't really have a good handle on who's vaccinated and who's not, under those circumstances, the CDC still recommends appropriately that we wear masks.
Dr. Fauci, as I've watched you over the last 20 plus months or so, it seems that your basic thesis is information, data are our friends. We need to understand more. So let me take you to a case very much in the news right now, getting a lot of focus, and that's the case of Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers. He now is saying the reason he avoided getting vaccinated was because he has perhaps some allergic reaction to vaccines. How prevalent is allergic reaction to this vaccine?
Well, there are only certain components. I'm not going to comment, and I want to make sure people know I'm not commenting about Aaron Rodgers. That is his individual choice, and I will not comment specifically on that. But specifically to your question, there are people who have allergic reactions in general, but there is not very many, in fact, very rare, that you would have an allergic reaction to a component of a vaccine, such as the mRNA vaccine. It occurs, but it certainly is not something that's common.
Okay, Dr. Fauci, let's go on, because a lot of people around the newsroom here otherwise are saying, what are our holidays going to look like? Because as you mentioned, it looks like the cases are plateauing. They're not continuing to fall. We see, meanwhile, in Northern Europe, particularly Germany, the Benelux countries, really it almost looks like another wave. Are we going to face a possible wave in the United States as we get into these holidays?
That is up to us, David, and it really relates to what I mentioned just a moment ago. If we get the overwhelming proportion of unvaccinated people vaccinated, and we get those who have been vaccinated and are eligible to get a booster, if we get them boosted, we can go a long way to preventing any surge as we go into the winter. And in fact, for vaccinated people, you should look forward to a good family type of gathering in the home, as we've always accustomed to do in Thanksgiving and in Christmas. I know I'm planning to have a family gathering with my family, all of whom are vaccinated, and enjoy the season. But with regard to the society in general, the community in general, whether or not we get a surge is going to depend on how well we get people vaccinated.
Doctor, finally, we have now this vaccine mandate coming out of OSHA. It's being challenged in various courts. You're not a lawyer that I'm aware of, at least, so I'm not going to ask you a legal question. But the challenge is actually based on a medical conclusion, which is whether we have a medical emergency. I wonder what you would say. If we qualified you as an expert witness, which you certainly would be in court, could you say this is a medical emergency? Because certainly it seems like less of an emergency today than it was 12 months ago, 15 months ago.
Well, I would think, not only myself, but anyone in public health, when we are in the middle of a pandemic that has already killed 750,000 Americans and infected 46 million and have killed 5 million at a minimum and maybe close to 15 million people worldwide, I think that would be equivalent to what we would say would be a medical emergency.
So I want to sneak in one final one related to this, actually, and that is the pill that you have said is potentially a very significant breakthrough. And there are, as you say, there are two of them, actually, some different data with respect to Merck and Pfizer. As a practical matter, is that going to discourage people who otherwise might get vaccinated?
Well, I hope not, David, because that would be a misperception of reality. The fact is, it is always, always better to prevent getting infected than it is to try and treat an infection. The pills, which are really very good for those who unfortunately get infected, it diminishes the likelihood of hospitalization by 50% in one of the products and 89% in the other product. But you know how you get to 100% chance that you will not be hospitalized is don't get infected in the first place.